God, I like that it gives you the option of got it or leave meeting. Welcome everyone. So the first slide you see is just an advertisement you'll see throughout this for the OUTniagara community calendar. I know we have folks today joining from across the province, and I'm very grateful for that. But for the folks based in Niagara, if you didn't know, OUTniagara has a community calendar where you can look up events happening in the region and post your events as long as they're aligned with OUTniagara's mandate. They don't have to be LGBTQIA or Two-Spirit specific, but rather it's about supporting each other and showing up for one another, which I'll talk about a lot today. So, but yeah, that's my pre-advertisement. Let me see. I have multiple screens going. So if I look up, that's because I have a slideshow in front of me like 2 or 3 times. Today's workshop, as you all got the email, was supposed to be also an Naloxone training. Unforeseen circumstances are really normal with event planning, as I'm sure many of you know. And so Claire couldn't make it today, but we're going to be doing a follow-up for everyone. And I'm going to just switch this mode so for recording purposes. But Claire's email's there, and we will connect you. If you're like, I need naloxone tomorrow, we can get you in contact with Positive Living. Just send us a message in the chat. But yeah, event planning, welcome. In welcoming you here today, I want to call attention to the fact that in doing event planning work, we always must first prioritize solidarity and support for the original and ongoing caretakers of whichever lands and territories you are on. I'm joining today's meeting from the Niagara region on the shared territories of the Ongwe-Homwe. This shared territory is held by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Chinootan peoples, and is a gathering place for so many different Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, Métis, and Inuit people. And also many people here brought here through generations of migration and forced displacement. And all of us, Indigenous, newcomers, settlers, and peoples whose families have lived here for many generations for a wide range of reasons, are responsible to uphold the treaties first made here. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement, or Dish with One Spoon Wampum. This pre-colonial treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee binds them to share the territory and protect the land. And ourselves, no matter your relationship to Indigenous communities, settlers, and newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And my screen is changing. And then we also want to call attention to various other agreements that are in place in our nation-to-nation relationships, including the Two-Row Wampum, including the 1974 treaty, 1764 Treaties of Niagara, which too often are not acknowledged as part of our legal Canadian treaties, but are an essential basis for nation-to-nation relationships. But yeah. And I come to this work as a settler. So I grew up in Thornbury, Ontario, which I don't know if folks know that region, but it's in the very southern part of Lake Huron in Georgian Bay, and is the traditional hunting territories of the Saugeen First Nation, which is a fact I didn't know until I was immersed in activism in a different territory, which was the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory, which is historically known as Ottawa, before moving to where I currently live. And in thinking about event planning, and really all of our activism, we have to look at how the legacies of colonization, racism, and capitalism are upheld. I should say 2022, not 2021, but every day of 2022 through our failures to address the ongoing attacks on trans folks, Two-Spirit folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks and people of color who have always been at the forefront for calling for the essential societal change. And those calls too often end up in violence towards those communities and their deaths, but they're the ones leading these conversations. So in talking about event planning today, we have to think about who are those leaders, who are keeping people alive and doing the work that we need around various forms of activism. And there's so many different ways we facilitate events every day. We coordinate dinner for our family. We come on events like this and we go to meetings. Events are a lot of different things, and services from Positive Living to Niagara to more community-based groups like Black Owned 905 to your interpersonal relationships are all part of this work. And we have to be committed to this work for our collective liberation. And I think the other important thing is, so I come to you from Niagara, and almost all territories in this world are under capitalism, which means there's an exploitation of labor that we have to be accountable to in doing event work. And in Niagara, we're a region that prospers off the continued exploitation of migrant labor and through our grape and wine industry, as well as our agriculture industries and home care. And so many of these workers face continued violence and job precarity. And we call on everyone in this meeting, as OPIRG especially, to look at the campaign around Status for All in Ontario, because we want more people at our events and we want to show up for their events. And migrant workers, non-documented folks, international students, and refugees need that support because they can't come to events if they don't have status, and it risks their job. And so thinking about that and bringing that into this space. Also, we mentioned here around universities, OPIRG works a lot with students at Brock. I know I have a couple of my placement students joining me today, and so welcome. Nice to meet you for the first time in the semester. But it's important when we think about the labor, especially around the labor of events, that we don't just think about the hosts, we don't just think about the participants, or in the case of a school setting, we don't just think of the profs or the students, but we think about the folks who maintain those spaces, the janitorial staff, the food service staff who too often face more precarious work conditions and aren't seen as valued employees. And I have here to call attention to Justice for Workers Niagara, who are working on a campaign to get all Brock employees 2 weeks paid sick days over the next few years, because that's something not all employees at Brock, as the largest employer and a huge host of events in our region, there's so many workers who don't have access to paid sick days, which we know right now more than ever. And we've always needed paid sick days, and we will continue to need them. So bringing that into the space. I also want to acknowledge all of you. So everyone who comes to event planning workshops, all 58 people who registered and could or could not attend, come with your own level of expertise, whether it's participating or planning or dreaming of or debriefing. We all have some relationship to events. And I really value your expertise. I can only speak to my knowledge, which is pretty extensive, but it's not yours. And so we always say at OPIRG, we're nothing without the people around us. And so I want to welcome you today and welcome all of your knowledge as well. In talking about activism in Niagara and really anywhere, we cover a whole range of topics, which can be triggering. There's no way to know someone else's triggers. So I encourage you, for both your mental and physical needs, to take breaks, stand up, move around as needed in your screen or not in your screen. Just keep in mind that these might come in contrast with other people's needs, and to be as respectful of that as possible. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about the OPIRG Brock Safer Space Policy as an event tool. And if we have time at the end, I can show it to you. But yeah. Welcome, everyone. So as I mentioned, I have a lot of experience in event planning. I was thinking about it last night, and I was a Girl Guides kid, so had to plan all those Valentine tea and skating shows and all the things as rural kids do. And events have been around me my whole life, whether it's weekly meetings or sports practices. whether it's going to family dinners at the holidays, there's always a level of coordination. But then I got more involved in more formalized event planning. I worked at the Student Union in Ottawa starting in 2008, so about 13 years ago. And I started on the OPIRG Ottawa Board of Directors, as well as the coordinator at the Center for Students with Disabilities at the University of Ottawa. So a lot of my event planning background comes with a disability justice lens. I grew up in a heavily disabled, low-income family, so that's where I enter a lot of these conversations. And then in 2017, I started working for OPIRG Brock because I moved to Niagara, and I happen to have the skills needed to coordinate things and bring people together. And so since OPIRG has a very odd history and a long history in Niagara, having worked here since 1988, which actually is 2 years older than I am. So, throughout the last 30 plus years, OPIRG's gone ups and downs. In 2018, we were defunded, and we're one of the only PIRGs functioning right now with no student levy. We won't go into that. It's a workshop on its own. And we reconnected with funding through QP 4207, and connections with unions are such an essential part of connecting around event planning that I think is undervalued. So that will come up probably throughout today. And then specific events we've planned through OPIRG include our Niagara Free Store, which we run weekly whenever we can in partnership with lots of great folks. We have run the coming out monologues, both volumes 1 and 2. We've done the Queer and Trans concert at Warehouse, worked with the excellent Maisie Bishop, who's on my screen right now. So hi, Maisie, on both the free stores and the community markets. And we do a lot of harm reduction stuff and placements at Brock. And so and I'm sure I'm missing some. My screen is too big. But the most important thing, I get asked all the time, like, what are OPIRG's events versus other people's events? And those are some of them, but we believe in partnership and we believe in collaboration. And that is really where we sit in terms of event planning. And then the other thing we keep, and we always like to talk about around events, is on the OPIRG website. On the main page, we maintain, it's a bit outdated right now, but a list of webinars and a list of ongoing events that you can attend, because thankfully the pandemic has shown us borders are useless and everyone's really understanding. We have no need for states anymore. Also, I'm speaking on behalf of OPIRG, just for clarity. And we have a lot of, I get really overwhelmed by all the Facebook invitations. I've heard similar things from other people. And so we keep a list of online webinars on our website. So it's much more easy to navigate if you want to do some self-education around social, economic, and environmental justice. And really through all our work, we work on the philosophy of good people knowing good people doing good things. And we want people to connect, and we want people to feel like they have the opportunity to self-educate without, and also like hold people accountable. Like those two things walk hand in hand. So, and we'll explore some of that today. Positive Living, who's my co-host for this, Claire couldn't make it today, but here's some information about them. HIV sector based on Queenston Street and St. Catharines, and they offer a wide range of information. I won't go too deep into it, but all their links and everything are throughout the presentation and will be sent out after, and you will get an email with the follow-up date for like the harm reduction and naloxone components of this training. One thing I really think is important to know is Streetworks and Positive Living Niagara host the Needle Exchange program, have a services van, an outreach van, and host the Safe Consumption site. This is a service that keeps people alive every day in our region, and we can't have events if people keep dying. As people keep dying, we keep trying. And the most important, like, we walk hand in hand as an activist organization with those who keep people alive. And Positive Living Niagara and Streetworks deserve so much credit for doing the work that's needed to keep people safe in our communities. And so please promote them and support that stuff. And if you have questions, Claire's information's at the end of the show, the slideshow. But yeah, so I was saying to Kate right before, I'm a very serious person. And so I tend to lead with the serious content first. So first thing to talk about is the limitations of events. So event planning is fun, it's exciting, it brings people in, it has community, but it's also it's not the be all end all of community building. And in Niagara, we have this tendency, and I'm sure it's true in other communities as well, to burn ourselves out just hosting events. And then we don't have time for the organizing that falls in between. And so it's important to understand before you even start planning your event, what are the limitations around event organizing? Also, just so folks know, these slides are going to get posted. And so I encourage people to take notes. I'm a note taker too. But just if you're like, I need to write down every single thing, I'm more of a talker. So just know you're going to get these jot notes. I can see people writing. So I'm like, don't stress yourself out. I was a terrible student in school. And so I'm like, you don't have to worry. It'll be cool. So limitations of events. Not every event can be everything, can be as accessible. Not every event can do everything we want it to do. And I think we want to strive for the best. And so today we're going to walk through some of those aspirational models of event planning around accessibility, inclusivity, all of that stuff. But it's okay that not every event is accessible. It's okay that not every event is everything to everyone. We live under capitalism. We live under a system where we are not built to work together. And so if you're like, ASL interpretation, we're going to talk about that today because it tends to be a big barrier for folks in getting event plans because they're like, I don't want to exclude people, but there are ways to do this a bit more strategically. Events are often non-consensual. We see this a lot in international solidarity work, where you see people support other people without speak on their behalf. As a queer, non-binary person, I listen to a lot of people self-identify as allies, and I don't enjoy when those people speak on my behalf. Do I want them to stop believing in good things and doing activism? No, not at all. But there is a level of consent when it comes to working with vulnerable communities and working with communities around advocacy. And so we're going to talk about that today. Event planning can be exhausting. Burnout is a conversation across all of our communities, and we often have events that just deplete our whole team, from graphics to hosting to follow-up, fallout. There's lots of ways it can exhaust us, and so I think it's important we talk about that from the beginning. We are constantly, and I'm sure this is true in other communities, but trying to balance between service provision and advocacy. So there are a lot of folks who work in Niagara, for example, in social services. And I know we have a lot of joining us today who do things like addiction services, who work in places that support people experiencing gender-based violence, who work in the HIV/AIDS sector. These are people who are providing essential services and also host advocacy and events. And then there's organizations like OPIRG who lead with the advocacy component and partner or provide services like the Free Store. And so finding that balance is something that we always have to negotiate. I mentioned urgency culture. We'll talk a lot about that today. The limitations of events are, I don't love doing minutes because I don't want to have to be the person who sends them out because I write messy minutes. And the follow-up of notes from an event is a limitation that we have to prepare for. Our partner organizations can be our limitation. So we all have different politics within our own service provision or within our own organizations. And we really have to be aware of like where other organizations stand in terms of their politics, as well as their timelines. You know, like if you're like, I really want to partner with OPIRG, but it's in the middle of my AGM season, I'm not likely to say yes. It doesn't mean you don't have a great idea. It just, knowing each other's timelines takes some work, which is why to use the OUTniagara community calendar as often as you can. We have a big reliance right now because we have to with the pandemic in the online sphere. This too often cuts out often older folks, rural folks, and folks who generally aren't like the most tech savvy, so non-English speakers or people who might learn differently or like have developmental disabilities. And so when we rely so heavily on online, we see a limitation. We can't bring people in. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have those events, we just have those limitations. Events always have opportunities for mistakes. I have hosted many an event where I've said the wrong thing and needed to be accountable. We can talk about those examples too if you want. But the more events you have, the more chance you have an opportunity to mess up or to harm someone, but it's also an opportunity to grow and be accountable and have some hard conversations. So it's a mistake, but it has a caveat. It's really hard to always be planning for accessibility. And I have like the key accessibility limitations there on the right. Just not everything's going to be accessible. We don't yet live in a world built to be accessible. Niagara just voted for unified transit and people still voted against it, right? Like we don't live in the most accessible area. And so keeping that in mind. And then I put the too many hands. So I often get people being like, how can I help you? And I am a bit of a procrastinator and have severe ADHD. So I have a hard time with people helping me because I do everything near the end of my time frame. But the other thing is like, it's really hard to have so many volunteers who are like, this is awesome, what do I do? And then you don't have capacity to make a plan for them. And then you lose them and you lose that buy-in. And so these are all things to be keeping in mind, not to deter you from hosting events, but just accounting for the fact like you might run up against these limitations. I'm sure you have more in your own experiences as well. And yeah, you're gonna see stuff on the slides where we can come back at the end if you have more questions around like accessibility, but I'm going to keep going because we have it covered in other sections. So why plan events? Starting with your timeline. So often, and OPERC has this experience a lot, we plan events one after the other, opposed to in a big plan. And we're really working towards having an annual plan opposed to just planning the next event because we identified that as something difficult and burnout. So a key goal that we go after is for folks attending your event, it's about taking the time you need to be thoughtful and consistent. So often it's really hard to be the organization hosting events all the time. And so scaling that back to how much time do you need to build a partnership? How much time do you need to develop the event? How much time do you need to properly promote it? We often say 2 weeks. This specific workshop kind of threw off my whole understanding of event promoting because we put it out 10 days before and there were 58 people. So that doesn't really track with this, but how much time do you need? Also, are you prepared to have one person show up, 10 people show up, 25 people show up, or 50 people show up? I've had events where I've hosted 100 people in an accessibility training. I've had events where no one's come. And so like you always in event planning, it's really discouraging when you do so much work and no one comes. And you think it's about you, and it's actually probably about the circumstances in which the event was changed. One, like needing to change the date really quickly and then not advertising with enough time for people to adjust, for example. What's your team's annual schedule? Like if you have a plan and you're like, okay, we want to host in April, in July, like every other month, for example. And then in March, someone comes along and says, we should host a giant gala. And then it plows through your whole plan. Do you have space for that kind of reactionary planning? Sometimes folks do, and sometimes it's needed, like emergency fundraisers are needed, vigils are needed, calls to action and direct action are needed. Like, it's not to say we can't plan events quickly, it's just thinking about it within your larger timeline and capacity. Also, are you aware of the other events happening in your region? So we always have a lot of different historical dates or community events going on. And so, and the example I often give is during any of the like fasting holidays, if you're hosting like events, you're likely having people who are fasting. if they observe Islam. And so are you cutting them out when you are having food at your events? Or are you cutting them out if you host the event right when they break fast? And so these are some of the things to start to be aware of when we're building, when we're expanding who we bring into our spaces and is keeping in mind, like this year, for example, was a very media predominant year for Indigenous people navigating grief and having to navigate the announcements around residential school systems. But it was also a year where people really wanted to show up and support Indigenous folks. And so how are you doing that in terms of like giving them space and not requiring them to do more labor for you, and also showing up and accounting for what's going on in the political context? Policing is another big example. We often see people want to have a lot of discussions around police when we see big news headlines of police murdering people. And so is that the right time to bring forth a campaign when you yourself like are not necessarily mourning what's going on in the news? And so just keeping in mind some of these like negotiating factors. Also, what is your internal versus your external event schedule? Every time you go to a meeting, you go to an event. And so I happen to go to a lot of meetings, so I'm pretty much in events all the time, as are many people I see on my screen, because I know I happen to know some of you. But please start counting your meetings in your event schedule, because if you have a week of meetings and then you have a giant event at the end, where do you have time to breathe? And so, and I mean, I say this making that mistake very consistently, but I want us to be aware of it in our strategic planning. Urgency culture is, like I said, people need time to respond. So I often have seen like people have competing priorities. So I have 2 jobs, for example, and am a full-time caregiver. Each of my jobs to the job itself feels like the most important thing. Plus my brother feels like the most important thing. So those are constantly at odds. And so I might not respond to someone else's biggest priority right away, which can slow down event planning, and that's okay. And it's taken me a long time to understand that slowing down and not just getting something checked off the list, but doing it in a good way that also feels good for the people organizing the event is something to prepare for. With the pandemic, I think it's important to talk about how we access online events. Does everyone know how to use the back end of Zoom on your team and have a stable internet connection? Unlikely. So what kind of training around online content are you looking for? Because I think there's a few, we want to be accessible, and having online events really helps make it accessible in some ways. But if you're setting people up with a platform they can't use, they're not going to have their event. They're not going to be able to maximize like using subtitles or engaging in the chat or using breakout rooms, like all these things that are seen as niche interests, but actually could be a lot more accessible to our different teams. Also, do you live in a community with a lot of turnover? In Niagara, we have a student population that leaves constantly and comes back constantly. We have a high migrant worker population, and we have a lot of older folks in the region who navigate different care homes, or they move in or out of the region. And so thinking about this turnover, do you want to have a big event right when that's meant for students, when students leave? Probably not. So April, December, that's exam period. Don't do it. But like February or October, students have their schedules, they're a bit more comfortable. You've had a month to advertise and they're all eager. Awesome. Migrant workers, you probably don't want to target them as your event audience as they're preparing to fly back to their various like home countries, or like in the height of their work season, because like they don't have space. And so I think negotiating those dynamics, and then similar, it helps understand the political context of what's going on. If we've just had, like St. Catharines went through a big public fire in the downtown this past year. And it really took a lot of attention and energy. And probably in those 2 weeks, there were not people attending events, especially if you lived in the downtown region. You were making sure your neighbors were okay. You were making sure you were trying to understand what just happened with that big fire. You were trying to like figure out if there, like who needed what, if there were emergency supplies needed. So just keeping all of these factors going into your timeline planning. And then being okay to cancel. This is probably the most disappointing part of event planning, is you might get it wrong and need to cancel, or life happens and you might need to cancel. I've been part of a team where we worked for weeks and weeks and weeks on, I can't even remember what the type of, I think it was a performance panel event. And 5 days before, one of the organizing members of the team brought up issues with whiteness and there being too many white folks on the panel, and we canceled. And like, that's not necessarily a commendable thing. It's just that it happens. It's something that you have to like think about in the starting concept of your work, of your event, your workshop, your meeting, like being prepared to be flexible. Today, when I found out my co-facilitator couldn't come, for example, like totally okay, life happens. People have needs that need to be prioritized over their work, over workshops, but we also had 58 people signed up. So it was that moment of like, should I do this on my own? And so we had that conversation of like, what would it mean to keep going in this case versus postpone? Sorry, also I talk really fast, and there's a lot of content, and I can talk about all of these things, I think, for hours. So if I'm going too fast or there's points you want to flag, please put that in the chat. Also, while we're going, we're a bit into it now, I would encourage folks to put who you are in the chat. So if I can see some of the names of organizations on my screen, but if you work with any organizations or want to share any of that with the other folks here, please feel free. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. So when we think about what's the purpose of your events, these are the categories. This doesn't come from any resource. These are things I've just come up with in terms of why do we have events? So we have events for organizing. So our meetings, for example, we have events for socializing. That's probably one of the most common. We have entertainment events, education, advocacy, recruitment, which is my favorite one, because any event that has a clipboard can be a recruiting event. Fundraising, service provision, feedback, credibility, spirituality or faith, and creativity. And so these are kind of like the big overarching, like, why would we have this? Well, we want to have this because we need to be accountable to something that's happened in the past. So then it's credibility. Or we want to have it because we like really would love to see queer, trans, two-spirit performers on stage. So let's have a concert, you know, like there's different things that bring us joy in this. And then I also put the point of caution. So for often we see people have events for reasons that might not be feeding into our community. Or they have events that need to be scaled back. So for example, doing too many things at once. As I said at the beginning, we all want all of our events to be everything. Even this workshop, I spent days trying to plug all of the information in, and it's okay to scale back. It's okay to have less. It happened with us with coming out monologues, where one of my board members was like, well, in addition to the performer, should we have a conversation and a panel? And I was like, save the panel for another day. A performing show is enough for me, which comes out of a lot of learning and not doing that correctly in the past. Also, people often have events for photo ops, and I'm sure this is true whatever community you live in, but we see a lot of photo op activism, and especially coming from queer and trans communities. I see it a lot in June, where I see companies show up at events just to be like, look, I care about gay people. And that's all they can, or they say, look, I care about some version of the acronym. it's a point of caution, I would say, and politicians are folks. I see this happen quite often. We saw this year, people spoke so much in the lead up to the federal election about residential schools and accountability. At the same time, they were trying to appeal paying families of residential school victims and survivors what they were rightfully due in the court. So just I caution people when they're like, this will be a great photo op. Think about what else you are doing that makes you even deserve said photo op. And like, should that be your goal? I really don't think so. It gives people a false sense of security sometimes. So OPIRG has had this problem before. We work on social, economic, and environmental justice. We speak the talk of intersectionality, which is like the Kimberly Crenshaw understanding of it. We understand the isms and all this stuff. However, is that if OPIRG is primarily white folks involved, is that actually a safer space? Is that living up to our politic? And so when we think about so many organizations, and I'm going to talk a lot about safe space stickers today, but anyone can buy a safe space sticker and put it on their door. Does that mean they've done the work to train their staff, to have policies if transphobia occurs, like have policies around police in their spaces? Potentially not. I've worked in offices where we had our stickers given to us, but we didn't go through those trainings. So I would just like caution around the false sense of security that events sometimes can perpetuate. And then, the caution around labor and follow-ups and the importance of sending notes afterwards, because being consistent helps build up that credibility as a organized event planner. Also, if people have questions, please put them in the chat. Kate will see them. We can not stop through, but I'll make sure to address them. I also got some questions before the workshop, and so if I don't cover them throughout, I'll make sure either re-ask them or I'll go back to them at the end. So Kate, can you put the link to the resources page on our website with the handout for today's workshop?
Sure can.
Thank you. On the OUTniagara website, there's a handout on how to get started with your events and how do you conceptualize. And I have a lot of dreams about handouts, and so you're going to see a lot more in the next little while. But yeah, starting with developing your concept. So thinking about, what do you consider events? Do you consider your like family dinners at holidays events? It's okay if you don't. I certainly do. It's a lot of labor. There's coordination, planning. There might be photos and social media. You probably have to bring gifts or food. Certainly sounds like an event to me. However, you might not quite feel that way. And then taking time. And so these starter questions, I hope you take with you back to your teams and back to your life afterwards when you're starting to plan an event. What do you love about attending and planning events? So I really like planning events because I like working with my friends. And it sounds crass and like simple, but it's like, I like working with people I like working with, and that means planning community events. And when it comes to attending events, I don't love that as much. I'm not a person who will go to a party happily. Give me a job, not necessarily an attendance. And then what does your team struggle with around attending events and planning events? Do you struggle with getting the social media out 2 weeks ahead of time? Do you struggle with like how to make your event accessible, or like not just having the same people speak over and over again? What role do you feel the events play within your region as a whole, and what role would you like to see them play? So right now, events in Niagara, for example, are very exciting. It's always really exciting to see a new event happen, especially in the pandemic. But could they be more strategic? Probably. Could we all be working together and not reproducing events? Likely. There's also a big divide in Niagara between the festival scene, which often happens in one of our main parks, versus the independent scene. And where does that money go? And so I think there's a few different factors at play when we think about what role could our events play in our region. And like I said, I work on the philosophy, good people should know good people doing good things, which means I want these things to be connected. If there are critiques of a downtown festival, like the Grape and Wine Festival, for example, around migrant workers, those conversations need to happen with the migrant workers group. And so like, how can we put these in perspective of each other? And are events effective means of bringing people in? I often see events are the things where new people show up, which is awesome. I really do want to meet new people. But do we see the follow-up happen? So if someone comes to your event, they sign up on your email list, and I know I'm really guilty of this, you send them a follow-up email in a newsletter like months and months later. That doesn't build buy-in. And it's something I know I have to really improve upon in my event planning. And so if you want your event to be the thing that brings people in, awesome, but also plan for the follow-up of that event. And then the other thing is conceptualizing. When we conceptualize events, really breaking down what we assume to be true, or what we already believe are events for certain types of people. So within your group, or whatever team you organize events with, asking what types of events do you associate with 2S LGBTQIA plus people? In Niagara, there is a very popular assumption that we all want to attend drag shows. That is true for some, not for all, myself included. I'm not a person who enjoys going to that environment, still identify as a 2S LGBTQIA plus person. So really breaking down some of these assumptions. What types of events do you think BIPOC communities want to go to? Folks who use substances want to go to? Homeless or houseless folks want to go to? Parents want to go to? Disabled folks want to go to? Non-English speakers want to go to? Young people want to go to? Old folks want to go to? And the list goes on. We all have these assumptions. Like I associate like playing cards with older populations because that's what my grandma loved doing. Doesn't mean all old folks want to go to a poker tournament, you know? And so it's like thinking about those, breaking down some of those ideas, because it'll help us be more creative in how we advertise. And so then it's about thinking about your team. Who do you want to organize with? And so often I've heard organizations are just the people who make them up. And that's true of your events too. The people on your organizing team should want to promote your event. They should believe in your event and feel connected to it. So thinking about who is on the internal team, like who are the people who are going to send emails, who are going to bring snacks, who are going to coordinate if you need permits, who are going to be the people who can take on those roles. And then who are the external people, which is who I think around facilitators or performers or volunteers. They're not necessarily people doing stuff on the inside of the event, but they are the face of the event. And so navigating what are those different types of roles? What brings you together as a team? Why do you all want to organize a rally, for example? Like you must all believe in one core thing. And we've seen this a lot with the street festivals. We saw a lot of awesome local businesses be like, we want to see activity on our streets again. And so they started organizing vendor markets because they wanted to see that interaction and also increase business. Do folks on your team need training before you go out and do your event? Whether this is harm reduction and naloxone, it might be first aid, it might be anti-racism or Indigenous solidarity training. What kind of training do you think is foundational? Who is and isn't involved? And how are the folks who are involved impacted by the topic? So for example, this is a 2S LGBTQIA plus education series. And for the most part, that's who we've been working with throughout this whole project. And really hearing those voices from the community. And then if there are folks who identify outside of that community, how are they connected to the folks most impacted? How do they hold the folks most impacted? Does everyone involved have a full picture of the information? So it happened this year where I was involved in an event where not everyone knew what was going to happen at the next in the various parts of the event. So they couldn't necessarily oppose, they couldn't necessarily agree. And that's what happens when you have very large scale events. And then it turned out to be like things were problematic and people had to be accountable. And I think having a more fulsome picture is a more consensual way to hold your organizing team. Everyone who's involved should know what's going on so they have the right to disagree or support as they need. What type of skills do you need? Are you really lacking a graphic designer? Because lots of organizations I know are. Then it's a lot of self-taught folks. So how can we start outreaching for skills? Not just like, please join our group, but like we're looking for folks who can write grants. We're looking for folks who want to do graphic design or love giving public presentations. And then that will help you build partnerships, because as you start to talk about your team, folks are like, I've seen amazing folks all introduce themselves today. Like, we want to work in partnership. Most folks do. And so being able to build those connections and show up to their events too, because I think that's the other thing. You can't just email someone and be like, hey, let's be friends and organize this thing. You have to know what they're doing. And it helps with knowing their timing. So like I said, AGM season, there's two big AGM seasons in a year generally for not-for-profits in Ontario. If you reach out to an organization to partner in their AGM month, they're not likely to even reply to you. It doesn't mean they don't like you. It doesn't mean they don't know the events, but often there's one or two of us just working at those organizations, or they're all volunteer run. And so being aware of some of that other competing factors. And then most importantly is the consent in your topic. So are you speaking on behalf of others? My academic training comes in a field around international relations. It's specifically, and something to be accountable for, is international development. In my field of study in university, people love speaking on behalf of other people. All they want to do is run fundraisers for people they don't know and people they're not connected to, and get gold stars for sharing things on Facebook that they actually have only read one article on. And it is, in a globalized world that we have, it is really easy to jump onto a cause. You should be supporting good things, and you don't have to be experts to be able to show up. However, if you start hosting an event, say on behalf of Indigenous folks as a settler, you are not giving them the right to disagree. That's not informed consent. And I have another slide specifically about this, but there's lots of examples. The Wet'suwet'en Support Toolkit is a good one, where it's like people have guidelines. The same way when you book a performer has a set of guidelines for, like, there's things like rosters, and there's things like proper a bio, for example. Let someone write their own bio. That is a more consensual act. And so when we think about the events we want to host, especially around advocacy, are you speaking on behalf of others? This happened to me very recently in a caregiver support group, where I was given a presentation from a non-caregiver who was very well-intended and a lovely, very skilled medical person, but they weren't a caregiver. And it was not a consensual environment. It did not feel good to be told about my own experience or have someone speak on behalf of me. And then I've been thinking a lot about how a lot of us are impacted by everything, if not all of us are impacted by everything, but we're not all oppressed the same. So for example, capitalism impacts all of us deeply. It does not oppress Jeff Bezos. It does not oppress Elon Musk, but they would say it does. And so thinking about when you're deciding to host an advocacy event, are you impacted by the topic? Probably. Are you oppressed by the topic? Maybe not. And so it is about understanding whose voices should be in the forefront of your planning. Who is the most harmed by the dynamics you're trying to change through your education, through your advocacy, etc. I'm not trying to say don't do good things and support fundraisers and petitions and all these things. Just being aware of your social location. and the power dynamics at play, because we so often reproduce things we want to challenge. We don't want all of our spaces to look the same. We don't want to keep going how we're going with this world. So really thinking about how you do and don't reproduce some of those norms, thinking about how you hold social capital. Like if you're a group whose receive is small, for example, but you get to be present always at the main festival, or you always get to speak at city council, or you always are the one to be seen as credible, it means you have a different position in your community than others. And so thinking about that social capital, changing where you hold the power dynamics. Also, we are an English heavy community and country, which is a colonial language. And things that are very liberatory, like queer, trans, two-spirit identities, are all fit within English and French languages often. And this is oppressive in of itself, even as it's liberatory for others. This example came up with Zoom, because Zoom default clicks last names. Many Indigenous languages I've recently and very graciously been taught don't have last names. And they also don't use pronouns the way English and French do. So removing or creating a space where it's not mandatory for folks to have to conform to English or French or any of these colonial languages, but get to experience a space the way is most liberatory for them. And then have you considered around your event team safety planning? Like, do people have a person they can't organize with? I know there's people in the community that like people's safety, even if it's something that's happened years ago, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to be on the same organizing team. It doesn't mean you'll even be able to be present in the same room. So do people on your organizing team need safety standards put in to make sure that they feel comfortable and not triggered in their meetings? I'm going to take a drink of water because that's what I'm talking. And then this brings me to taking care of your team. So the team, and I realize we haven't even gotten to the minutia of event planning. And the reason is so many of these internal aspects need to be sorted out to be able to host good events. Things have to feel good on the inside to also feel good on the outside. Which sounds very therapy speak, so I'm so sorry, but also it's been really helpful for me. You have to feel confident, right? And so your team has to feel confident and taken care of. So I have some interesting relationships to individualized self-care, but I really love concepts of collective care and holding our needs in the forefront. So if someone needs a meeting to end at a certain time because they have to catch a bus to go to their job, or go to take care of a family member, or go just be alone, that's okay. We should be able to talk about it. And that person should not be judged for needing the meeting to end on time, as an example. So how do we hold people's needs as part of our organizing opposed to accommodations? People's needs are not add-ons, they're the things that make up who we are. So what are the needs of your organizers? What are the needs of your facilitators and your performers? What are the needs of your participants? You won't catch everyone and you won't catch every need. My computer needs to get plugged in. But you can ask the questions. You can set the standard of talking about people's needs. How do we break down the urgency culture? This is a question I ask myself all the time. How do we give ourselves enough time to do what we need to do when everything feels so urgent? Everything feels like if we don't solve it right now, tragedy awaits, and it probably does await. But tragedy will await either way. So how do we caution ourselves at exhausting? How do we have honest debriefing discussions and move beyond the waited out phenomenon? So when awkward things happen in meetings, so often the meeting ends, whether it's in planning or at the event itself, and we just give ourselves enough time where no one will bring it up and we just move on. So how do we have, instead of waiting each other out in our awkwardness, How do we build in structures for debriefing? Breaking down politeness is also something I've had educated to me and been talking about a lot in this project, in terms of it is impolite to act polite in many situations because we believe politeness is not bringing up hard conversations. We believe politeness to be not causing conflict. We believe politeness to be gendering people, for example, like sir or ma'am, all these things. We believe politeness to be a certain set of standards, which is not true. It's more polite to have the hard conversation, like deal with the situation, and then be able to move on in a good way with both parties feeling like there was some honesty there. How do we set boundaries and expectations and deadlines? Like, I often need deadlines to be able to get stuff done. And we need expectations so people know when to reply. People don't want to be disrespectful and ignore emails or ignore event requests, but giving people deadlines and boundaries helps us negotiate our own spaces as well as the spaces of our team and the participants. What are the different communications options that your team is using? Right now, I use Telegram, Slack, Asana, Microsoft, Google, lots more Google, Zoom, like there's so many platforms. So having consistency around communications. The one platform I don't do organizing on is Facebook. I refuse to do it. I hate a Facebook message conversation. That's not just social because you just have this giant thread. Do you have boundaries around communications, and do people on your team have those boundaries? I talked a bit already about self-care versus collective care. Intentional space for accountability is similar to debrief. Do you have systems built in if something happens and goes wrong, or people need other people to be held accountable? Sometimes it's easier to create boundaries with safety, and sometimes there's not the opportunity for accountability, but just offering it changes the tone of your organizing team, and allows for things like check-in and also having resources on hand. So I had a question on the registration that I thought was really good, which is like, how do you reach out to people you haven't worked with before, either in as a facilitator or a community partner? And it is pretty depending on who you're reaching out to. But I have a lot of experience with this in terms of like sending a cold call email. And so always if you can have a personal connection with the person you're trying to reach to host and to pay, that's awesome. Go through the personal connection first. Totally okay if you don't have those. I really strongly recommend email, but sometimes email goes to junk mail. So keep this in mind. I don't recommend social media messages unless you're asking for their email. Everyone who wants to host and facilitate, and if they don't want to do that, then they'll tell you, but like has an email. So save yourself the Instagram notification or the Facebook notification. Ask for their email because it'll keep it also within your work hours and within their work hours. There's nothing more stressful than 11 o'clock at night getting an Instagram message from a community partner and deciding whether to click it, because then they'll see that you clicked it and it's open and they saw that you saw it, and then you're choosing to not reply. And it's a phenomenon across sectors. And so ask for people's emails. It'll keep things consistent. And don't be afraid to phone call people. I don't love phone calls, but it gets the job done. And it's likely people just missed your email. You're not bothering them if they followed up. They will not answer if they don't want to answer you. And the other thing is, do you have guidelines for collaborating? Do they have guidelines for collaborating? Do that research ahead of reaching out, because it'll make it easier to put in the details in your email, because you'll already know. that they've put on their website they're available June and July for workshops, you won't email them asking for May. And so taking that time to understand where they're at. Also, I often hear from people, well, we put an open call out, no one replied, or no people of color replied. And the problem is how you outreached, not necessarily that no one saw your call out. People saw your call out. Going to people and understanding who's in your community and who could benefit from, say, a paid opportunity like an honorarium or a ability for networking, bring to them. People don't have to struggle anymore. I've heard a lot of things, especially working on the edge of the arts community, of like, well, I had to go through all this finding grants and I had to go through all this struggle. And it's like, we don't have to let people struggle anymore. We can bring the information to them. It's okay if people say no. But I think the thing to keep in mind, so say you want to have a panel with a two-spirit speaker. If you only know one person who identifies as two-spirited and they say no to you, that's more a time to reflect and ask, why do I not have the connections that I want to have? What work do I need to do and research within my community? How do I need to better show up for two-spirit folks, for example, to make sure that they trust me and that they're willing to have this conversation, because it very quickly can become tokenism. And so when you're writing the email, these are my key, what you include: who you are and how you got their contact information. It's probably off their website, but if you got it from a personal contact, people want to know why you think they're a good fit for your event. What is the deadline for replying and the timelines you're working with? What money are you providing them? We need to pay people way more for their labor, and we are moving in that direction. But we are working off a decade of people being like, do it for the views or for the public credibility, or educate me because we want to learn and we want to show up for you better. People should not have to do that. Pay them. And in the email, tell them how much money they'll be expecting. And if that's outside their or below their range, they can say no to you. They have the right to. It's okay. Who are the other folks involved? Maybe you want to reach out to this really great performer, but they've had a really bad experience with one of your community partners. They should know that that community partner is involved in the planning from the get-go. And so they can say no. Or if they're like, I loved working with this organization, they might say yes. And so making sure everyone knows who's involved. What platform you're going to use, especially in COVID. Are you going to be online or in person? That's a huge question these days. And how many people do you want to plan for? Often we will say to people, how many people do you want in your workshop, and let them set the tone. But it's okay to have those expectations. And then make it really easy. What is the next step that they have to do to reply to you? Like, is it replying to that email? Is it filling in a form? Is it a deadline? Make their lives easy, because it will get you a response quicker. And so I know this was a question that came in the registration. So if folks want to talk more about this at the end, we can. Then in planning your event is thinking about the audience. So you started out with yourself, you started out then with your team, then you were like, who do I want to facilitate and be on the external group? Now it's who do you want to bring in and what is your goal for the audience? Like I've said, I've done events where no one has come. I've done mandatory trainings where hundreds of people have come and half of them didn't listen. So like there's always an in-between. And it is good to have a goal, even if you don't reach that goal, because then you can talk about it in the debrief. And the other point is, like, say you set your goal at 50 people, it's likely you're not going to know all those 50 people. So are you ready to take on those new perspectives within your event space or within your organizing team? We see this often with volunteer callouts where people are like, we need volunteers, but they're not quite ready for the questions or the lack of clarity that volunteers highlight. And so how do we navigate those pieces? Are you preaching to the choir, or are you looking for new people? It's totally okay to have events with people who agree with you. It's morale building, it's community focused, but then your focus is not recruitment. It's morale building and upholding the community. But there is a space for new folks. Like we can have events where it's like, we're so excited to have 10 new volunteers join us. 10 new volunteers aren't necessarily going to agree with everything you're going to say. So like, how do we shift our focus? What structures do we build so that new folks can easily navigate your space? Are there advertising timelines and platforms that your audience especially look to? I have been told several times that Facebook is not useful to young people, but useful to everyone else. I've been told Twitter is only useful for some, but still useful for everyone else. I've been told TikTok is only useful for young, but I don't think that's true, though I don't really know how to use it, / don't at all. And so what platforms are you advertising on? Because that will help determine who comes into your space. Are there financial barriers for your audience? For this workshop today, my mom said to me, are you charging the people coming? Because Oprah could use that money. And I said, no, that's not how it works. We want these events to be free so that people can come and learn and connect with each other. And so any opportunity to have free events, we always encourage, because it brings more people out. But advertise, it's free. People assume they can't go to events for XYZ reason. If you can make it free, make it free. If you can't, like, be upfront about those costs and where the money is going, because people are more likely to want to pay if they know, like, the money's going to the artists who are performing, or the money's going to your fundraising pool, or the money's going to a donation to a community organization. Are there accessibility needs for your audience? Probably. Accessible venues, we're going to talk a lot about in a second. And also, like, safety needs. If you're having an event that ends at 8 p.m., do you have clear instructions on how to get to safe transit? Do you know people have safe rides home? Those types of things. For your audience, you can stack the audience. People think it's a weird thing to do, but you can ask people will ask you questions or support what you're doing, be in the audience, because it fosters the conversation, because you've likely have those conversations before. And yeah, having the preparation plan, if no one comes, if 2 people come, if 50 people come, you might end up with one of the best conversations you have of your whole life if only 3 people come to your event that's planned for 20, which sucks in some ways and is rad in others. So just keeping that in mind. So this brings me to the different models. And I wasn't actually able to get to all these things in the slideshow with timing, but I want to walk through what some of these topics mean, because I hear them all the time. So we all talk about wanting the following things, but we rarely have systems or tools to achieve them. Safer spaces at events is probably the most common thing, especially I hear about queer and trans events. Inclusive and consensual spaces we want. I would also put, like, decolonial is under that category. We want accessible events. We want events that incorporate harm reduction. We want events with high attendance, and we want multi-generational events. These are things we hear all the time, but we actually struggle with achieving. Other things we often hear are fun, impactful, fulfilling, and community building. These are actually often more useful terms, because the fun is in the eye of the beholder, I would definitely say, and is subjective. But safe space, there's a set of standards. Impactful is, again, it's in the eye of the beholder, but inclusive is not. And so really repositioning how we think about some of this terminology, and going back to not everything can be everything for everyone. But yeah, So this brings me to safe space. So the image on the screen is, I typed in safe space sticker into Google, and the first thing that came up was a set of ads on how to buy those stickers. Over any Google search, over any training, the first thing you could do is buy the stickers. And I was like, okay, if that is what people are seeing when they search that, they're very likely to buy the stickers. Redbubble and Etsy seems to be the most popular over evil Amazon. Though maybe they're all bad, who's to say? Everyone, I can think of 5 businesses downtown St. Catharines right now who have these stickers in their windows, and I know have not gone through training on 2S LGBTQIA inclusivity, for example. I worked at one of those businesses for a very long time. And I think it's important that we move away, and it sounds pretty cynical, but we need to understand that trust is not the default we live in right now. People do not trust that places are safe, or if they do, they will be burned. And so then they don't. And I think having that as our, like, it's a bit scary, but like having the standard of like, our audience doesn't have to trust us. They are not required to. So we will do what we can to build a safe and inclusive environment. And there's a lot of steps around that. And so it's impossible for things to be safe for everyone. This is why we hear terms like OUTniagara has a safer space policy. It's the things we aspire to, because we don't know everyone's mental health triggers. Clowns, fear of clowns is a strong example. I have a phobia of rodents, for example. I'm not going to go to something about liberation around intersectional liberation around animals that has to do with rodents, because that will cause me a mental health crisis that I don't enjoy. And no one's thinking about that when they're planning their rally or their advocacy. That's okay. I can choose to not go, but I need to know what's there. It happened to me once where I was at work at OUTniagara, and there was some kind of animal awareness thing outside my office door, and all of a sudden there were rodents outside my office door in cages, but still, it's just not. I got to go home because I was like, I cannot deal with this. We have in so many of our spaces, whiteness and settlers are predominant, and it's very consistent amongst many of the organizations I know are here today. And this means it won't necessarily be safe for everyone. And you can strive and have those conversations. It also doesn't mean like an all BIPOC space is necessarily going to be safe to BIPOC folks, all BIPOC folks, but really unsettling this homogenous idea of like, we care about environmental justice, so we must be a safe space. We are a bunch of gay and trans folks, but we're all white, but we must care about a safe space. You know, like really rethinking what we assume people think is safe. And having intentional planning. Do you have policies, both internal and external, around safer spaces? So if we have time, I can show you the OUTniagara one, but we use this as our catch-all. So when we have events like this event, we're like, this is covered under our safe space policy. And it's so that we have a safeguard if something problematic is happening, like Zoom bombing. We've also had people who are banned from our organization show up to events. So then we're like, no, violation of our safer space policy, you need to leave. And it's about that security. And like, I don't want to have to pull out a policy to make sure everyone at an event is safe, but sometimes you have to, because people will be like, you can't ask me to leave, it's a free country. And I would question their idea of free country and also say, I don't have to deal with you right now. I have a document that says you get to go. And then also, is there a follow-up? Because we don't live in this like very you are bad or you are good world, but like, do you have a team who is willing to follow up with that person to tell them why they were asked to leave, or that they've been in violation, that doesn't put the person who's most harmed in connection with that person. And then also, do you have intentional practices between your partner organizations? So for example, if if two organizations both have volunteers present, but there's some kind of conflict between those volunteers that have nothing to do with the organizations, can the one volunteer say, hey, that's my ex, I can't be around them, to the people they're volunteering for, and then have the other organization agree to ask that person to leave, for example. It's happened within OPERG spaces. And so, yeah, thinking about some of these structures so we can have safety planning. Also, you don't have to have, I'm not saying stop doing events until you have all these things. I'm just saying these are things to strive for when we think about safer spaces. And then involvement of security. So we have seen many public calls about police, security guards, private security, things like community watch groups that reinforced racist systems of violence. And I think the call for no police at Pride is a good example, where people should know what they're walking into. People should know if police will be present, because or if security guards will be present, because you don't, like, we know, we have the internet, we have public news, we know there are inherent systemic triggers for people. And often we hear the argument, well, not all police officers are bad. I'm not here to debate people's individual relationships to their family members or to the justice system or anything like that. What I know is we see systemic attacks on Black communities and Indigenous communities by police, and on to us LGBTQIA+ communities by police. And we've seen like attacks in Hamilton, we've seen attacks in Toronto, in Montreal, so like the list goes on. And we also see harassment of homeless people and houseless people across the entire country. And so we know that normative models of security make our spaces not necessarily the safest for those involved. So being upfront about who is present. Do you have a marshal system at your rally instead of police services? Are you required to have police because you're having a big public festival? What is your responsibility around navigating those dynamics? But being upfront about what kind of security systems, whether it's policy, people, etc., will give people more choice. And the more choice you can give people around their own safety, the better, because they can make informed choices. Yeah. So these are some of our best practices, not comprehensive at all. And each one could be their own training, really. Do the internal work first. Do the training you need to understand navigating safe spaces for your organizing team and your participants and yourself. And I always recommend that people start with Indigenous solidarity. We are on, I think all of us here are on Indigenous lands. And so if you are not already engaged in that work or have gone through that training, there's a free training from the University of Alberta called Indigenous Canada that you can get online if online courses work for you. As a starting place, do that training with your team and talk about the training. Do you have a statement of values? We see this often around supporting sex workers, policing, like trans exclusionary feminism. Like, these are things that run alongside our different spaces. And so do you have value statements that are upholding your event? OPERG's value statement was just reworked into our safer space policy, for example. So body liberation is a key value, and then we put it into a policy around like ensuring people have the right to choose how they want to identify, like not judging people and keeping sex workers in our community safe. Yeah, lots of different examples. Also, within our policies, they help us onboard people. So we all talk about wanting more and more people involved. If you can hand them a document as homework, awesome. They know where you're at, getting involved right away. Then there's also minimizing perceived conflicts of interest. So like this often comes around like money accountability and also just general safety accountability. Do you have capacity for follow through on your safer space practices? OPIRG has built up against a reputation of having some very harmful practices, which is very true. It's a history we don't shy away from. But to build up credibility in that way, we had to be consistent with acting on our safer space policy. We had to be consistent with our follow through to ensure that like we understood what it meant to build a safer space from start to finish as much as we could. And then how do you revise? And how do you like go back to your policy and be like, oh, we really could have added, we should add in this piece that we were missing. Often that information comes in hindsight, unfortunately, but who is responsible for revising that policy and how do you bring that back? And then my favorite topic of 2021 is talking about how to incorporate healthy conflict into our spaces, from organizing events and follow-up. I could probably spend the rest of the time rambling about healthy conflict, but instead, I'm going to read you a quote from OUTniagara, which is the advisory committee to OUTniagara's room agreement, which defines healthy conflict and is a really useful tool I have found for discussing what conflict means. So we come to these discussions with different perspectives, backgrounds, experiences, and education levels, which can lead to all levels of conflict. This should be a place where we can engage in healthy conflict. Healthy conflict does not mean combat, violence, or abuse, but rather all situations, big, medium, and small, where we disagree, where we actively hold space for various emotions, reactions, considerations, dialogue, perspectives, active listening, as well as the option to take time and space to take care of ourselves and to reflect, self-educate, follow up, be accountable, and recover. Conflict is not combat. And like the sooner we are willing to have disagreements, we have disagreements all the time. You disagree with your roommate on what to get on the pizza last night. You disagree with your partner about who should do the dishes. Those are conflicts that you easily resolve, which means you have skills in conflict resolution. And so we can bring those into our spaces. And we can have these conversations. We can disagree and still want the same things overall. And that's a hard thing to understand. And it's a hard, like as a kid who grew up very unwilling to have conflict, now being like, let's talk about it all the time, is a very big jump from earlier in life. And then I have specific slides on like, if a conflict happens at your event, how do you deal with that? How do you have that follow-up? Are you prepared to have that follow-up and have capacity around it? And there's a resource linked there that you'll get in the slides as well, that talks about the potential of embracing each other in all of these different disagreements. I won't go into too much detail because time. We also talk a lot about inclusive spaces, and this will be the other model that I go in a bit more in depth in. And this goes back to those prompt questions. What does inclusivity mean to your organization? I hear the word inclusive all the time, and yet I still don't really understand what it means, because inclusivity is not one thing. It's both nothing and everything all at once. And so when you think about inclusivity, who are you including? Because you're not including everyone, though you might be trying. And my favorite example is 2S LGBTQIA+ means a lot of things. Literally, it's an acronym of many words to a lot of different people. This acronym can't be everything to everyone. We are not a homogenous community. We are not one thing. We need this acronym because we need to navigate the spaces that we have, and we need a sense of connectedness. And lots of people have different relationships to the acronym, but we can't have one event is a 2S LGBTQIA+ person and be like, everyone's represented. We're inclusive of everyone. Unlikely. Which, like, if you, like, I was trying to think through yesterday what was the best way to do it. It would be like, if you had an open call out with positions for each of the acronym and multiple people applied and it wasn't tokenism, and I just like talked myself into a spiral of like, I don't think this is possible. And it goes back to those questions of why are you hosting the event? Are you speaking on behalf of others, or are they in the forefront? We also, like I talked about with safe space, how do we navigate reproducing and getting through whiteness, ableism, ageism, and classism in our spaces? So many of us work with academics, I'm guessing on the call based on who I can see. And academia tends to be white, upper class dudes who speak English if you come from Niagara, or cis women who fit those other categories, who speak a very specific type of elite English that has profited capitalism. And so when we're navigating all of our events, we have to know that this is present. We can't be saying we're inclusive and have a whole panel of profs. Profs are not inclusive. They don't know, they could have gone through so many struggles in their life to become a prof. They still work within a corporate institution, which is not the same experience as someone who does not. And so when we think about the isms and the different power dynamics, whose voices are coming to the forefront? Because we will see the same people over and over. And then going back to the question of, are you speaking on behalf of others? Because if you are, what work have you done to change who is in the forefront? OPERC, for example, we have a priority around having BIPOC and QT BIPOC prioritized events with a board who is about half BIPOC, half white people, still a lot of white people. And so what work have we done to really move that needle? We had a year and like the answer is never ending, and is working on an action plan towards our board not being mostly white people, having a staff member who's not a white settler. And those are big long-term goals. And really allowing the folks who are leading these conversations to be the ones who are experiencing the topics we're talking about. Going back to, is it inclusive if you talk the talk of safer spaces, but don't actually know what it means to enforce safer spaces or follow up or check in or ask? Because otherwise you're just really reproducing this false sense of security. And then I have a list of buzzwords to maybe caution yourself around. Ally and allyship is on there, and I know people have different relationships to that term. And I just caution people at self-identifying as allies, because there's a lot of material around letting you might be an ally to someone in your family, and it does not mean you are an ally to complete communities. There's no homogenous experience with allyship, and so keeping that in mind and moving it. Many of these words are adjectives by category, but should actually be verbs. They are about action. Creating brave spaces is an intentional action. It's something that we try for and we build together. It's not something that just exists. And then thinking about, are we tokenizing people when we bring them to the forefront? Do you have one trans friend who is the person who's always on your trans panel, or always the trans voice on your panel? Likely that is a problem. It means you haven't done the work to show up for the other trans people in your community. Yeah. And then the last piece I'll say around inclusivity is specifically around Indigenous solidarity and land acknowledgements, because this is something that gets brought up a lot in event planning and accountable event planning. And it goes back to the question we asked with safer spaces. What do you do on a regular basis outside of just hosting events that prioritizes Indigenous solidarity and anti-racism in this country? Because if you are involved in that in a regular basis, you will know how to better showcase calls to action. You will know who are the Indigenous folks leading some of these conversations in our communities. And it can be as small as listening to a radio show or a podcast every week, to going through a free online course, to talking about this every night at the dinner table. There's lots of different things we can do. Are you self-educating your team and yourself before you are doing the work? And I in this, I'm specifically speaking to primarily settler organizations and event organizers. What type of self-education have you done? And then also, are you accounting for the political context of the community and of the country and of various nations? Well, 1492 Land Back Lane was happening. Were you talking about it when many of our, I know there's people from across the province, but Niagara neighbors, Haldimand County, that was a very important political moment and call for support from Indigenous folks. Were you talking about that while it was happening? Are you still talking about it? And then do you go to Indigenous folks events? Do you go to the powwow that happens and the various events that are open to different settler communities to start to build those relationships? In Niagara, we have Celebration of Nations, for example. And that's a great opportunity to see a showcase of Indigenous artists and meet other Indigenous theater goers and activists and performers in the region. And then I put a resource to the Wet'suwet'en support toolkit, which is around the consent and listening to Indigenous communities on the best way to show up for them. Because often we see, I'll host a fundraiser, but they have guidelines on how you use their name, how you socially profit off supporting their struggle. And so I think it's, all of this is linked. And then we touched on this before. How does some of your work limit the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and non-Western, white settler Western folks? I've heard a lot of good criticism around coming out. As the host of the organization that hosts the coming out monologues, coming out is not everyone's story. It's not everyone's experience around being Two-Spirit or LGBTQIA+. So how do we recenter some of these conversations to change, to not just have a Westernized settler narrative? And then thinking about the term decolonization, I linked a blog post article from Patty Krawick, who is an activist in Niagara and a podcaster who is awesome. And she writes about the word decolonization and specifically cites other articles critiquing the idea of decolonization means land back. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing Indigenous solidarity, but you should really be thinking about if you are a settler who's self-identifying as decolonial, what gives you the right to do that if you are not giving the land back as the core priority? And so I would really encourage folks to read this. All of these resources are created by Indigenous folks who really have more insight than I do around doing inclusivity and support for Indigenous solidarity. The last one is my favorite zine to reference, which is Accomplices Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally Industrial Complex, which I talk about all the time because it's such a good example of both showing up for Indigenous folks, written by Indigenous folks, and to us LGBTQIA+ movements, because we get the word ally quite often. And it really shows how to reposition ourselves in terms of showing up for solidarity work. And then I have specific information around land acknowledgements and solidarity statements on understanding what is the truth of this country. So I've linked the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action as a foundational document for building your land acknowledgement. And I've had a lot of conversations this year about how should organizations have land acknowledgements, or should we be rotating and we each write our own land acknowledgement and share that? And how can you do that if you have a public statement on your website? And again, this is a whole separate conversation that should be led by Indigenous folks. Our best practice is always using all of our platforms to acknowledge. So our email signatures, our website, having land acknowledgements built into our events, but knowing that this is zero. This is like the base that we need. This is not Indigenous solidarity. It's the very foundation of a start. And so really thinking about, maybe you could rotate land acknowledgements within your organization, and each of your board members or each of your organizing committee could write their own and share that, because we each have our own relationships to settler and Indigenous communities, and should be able to share in those conversations. But yeah. So right now we're at 3:40. So we're doing okay, actually. A little bit behind time. I have, like I said, you're gonna get all of these slides, and the harm reduction pieces are really Claire's. And so I'm not gonna speak on Claire's behalf about what she's an expert in, but there's I have 3 slides around accessibility, because like safer spaces and inclusivity, we want everything to be accessible all the time. We don't live in an accessible world, and we don't live in a non-ableist or sanist world, though I wish we did. And so not everything will be accessible. So on these slides has some pro tips around considering, like, what is the start and end time of your event? Are you hosting do you have access to transportation tickets or transportation stipend? What supplies do you have on site? And this is where Claire and I work together often to make sure organizations always have Naloxone and sharps containers on site at events, so that people who use substances can more easily navigate those spaces. Also, in Niagara, we have huge stigma around needles outside, which really comes back to harm people who use substances. And it's not accessible to have a person walk into an event and then be accused of a needle being outside. So having things like a sharps container and training on like getting rid of that, so that it's not, no one is targeted for this, because we know that's a popular thing that's been happening. It's really important with all of these accessibility measures that you talk about them, whether it's announcing them at the beginning of the event, putting them in your event description, because similar to no one has to trust you, people who need accessibility measures believe things are not accessible. And which brings me to my example around ASL interpretation, because it's one I've gotten often. We all want ASL interpreters at our events. It's very common. They are very hard to book, and because they are working all the time. In Niagara, we actually don't have, as far as I know, a specific service that offers it. It's like contracted through Hamilton, which is an additional barrier. Thankfully, online makes it a little bit easier, but you need to give interpreters like enough time to learn the content, to learn any specific terminology. And if you do all that work and you don't advertise your event to deaf and hard of hearing communities, you wasted your time and money, and you wasted the interpreter's time, because folks who work in deaf communities and like are part of deaf culture, they have their own structure around event organizing. They have their own like really culture around events. And unless you are specifically being like, this is accessible to you, they are unlikely to believe it's accessible to them. And so we've added things like subtitles, but I don't love reading subtitles. I wouldn't force someone else to have to read subtitles. And a good example is the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto runs a specific deaf culture art series. So the whole event is all in ASL or Francophone, depending on the artist. I think it's FLQ is the language acronym. And they have specific programming to build up that credibility and that trust and that connection with deaf communities and hard of hearing communities. And so when we're thinking accessibility, we so quickly jump to ASL. And so I just want to I want to use that example because I often get it as a question of like, how do you book interpreters in time? And I usually am like, do you have a relationship with deaf or hard of hearing communities, firstly? And if you do, you probably do know how to book them, or you know someone who knows someone. And so I would encourage folks to go through these slides because there's a lot of different ways to be accessible to neurodiversity, accessible to people who have different mental health issues, accessible, physically accessible, which is a very common example. Like you can have a ramp into a building, but if there's no accessible washroom or no accessible water fountain or no accessible sharps container, do you have an accessible building? That's debatable. Like, are the seats of your, say you have a big speech, large enough for folks who have different body sizes? This is something we miss often. And then we also end up stereotyping people when they come in the door. Like these are important accessibility measures that aren't necessarily related to disability. And so thinking about what we think about accessibility. Yes, Kate, I see the 15 minutes. So yeah, I would encourage folks to go through these slides and really think on the accessibility of your event and what you believe that to be. There's also information in the slides, obviously, about harm reduction. We have the instructions for how to safely clean up needles in public spaces, and how to get access to sharps containers. And then I have best practices around online events, in-person events, and promotion. The one thing I want to flag in the promotion piece is something I've realized this year is all organizations and event planners should set up a set of communications guidelines, both for your team. So that's like, who should you tag? What hashtags should you use? Like, what platforms are we working on? As well as for media. We don't have great experiences in Niagara around media and people not being misgendered, or people who have experiences of poverty not being portrayed in a pitying way. And so do you have standards around different media sources talking about your event and talking about your people? Because I think this is an undervalued thing that I want to think a lot more on in the months to come, because we should be allowed to depict ourselves how we want without like transphobic and ableist media getting the upper hand. I'm so tired of being misrepresented or having organizations that work really hard being like patronized. And I'm 1,000,000% tired of people I love being misgendered in the media and then watching the comment section explode when those get changed. So how can we establish some of those standards? And then I'll bring it back to the ad for the community calendar. There's a gajillion other things I want to say, obviously, about, especially around the security piece, but yeah, we'll talk about that in the follow-up, specifically around harm reduction. But I would encourage you to check out this calendar and promote your stuff. And yeah, we have 13 minutes before the conclusion of this session. Thank you everyone for coming. If you want to ask a question, Kate had said, put in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and we'll work on spotlighting you, because we're reminding people that this is recorded. That's another important safety accessibility thing. Please always advertise that you are recording things, because people want to know what, like, this will be posted, for example. And so maybe you don't want to say, my employer does all these things, it makes me so mad, you know, like I just want people to be safe and cautious as they need. So as people are, Megan asked me a question. Do you have suggestions for resources on importance of sharps disposal and naloxone for organizations trying to convince our organization to provide? 1,000,000%, Megan. Yes. So the counterpart to this workshop is called Incorporating Harm Reduction into Your Organizing, which is likely the follow-up that will happen. And Positive Living and OPIRG Brock have a whole bunch of resources. In fact, on the OPIRG Brock website, there's now specifically a page around harm reduction, targeted at Brock students, but specifically around like, why is this important? And the other like tidbit I would give people is like, people don't just, there's so many stereotypes and so much stigma around using substances through needles, and people have a lot of reasons they use needles. And so like, whether it's to administer medication, access to steroids, access to substances, both legal and illegal, the biggest reason is like the stigmatization around substances is it's a social construct, right? Like we decide what's legal and illegal. We decide what we believe is chaotic and not chaotic. And Claire talks a lot about moving away from the fact that people use substances as a problem to behavior-based language. So if someone's causing harm within your space, they can and can't be involved like on substances. I've had lots of situations where perfectly sober, straight cis dudes have done shitty things at my bar, and they've had nothing to do with substances. And I've also had people really need sharps containers to dispose of so that they can go about their night without having like a needle in their bags. Maybe they don't want that. Maybe they don't have a sharps container on them. And so, Megan, I can connect you directly with Claire. And hopefully the second part of this is specifically about harm reduction and incorporating that into your work. Well, people think of other questions. I know one I got in the registration was how to plan events that youth want to come to. I recently was on a meeting with the Youth Wellness Hub based in Welland, Ontario, and their staff was talking about how they had, with the pandemic, they had their youth committee design their space, like physically design the aesthetic of their space to be welcoming. And I was like, that's a genius idea, because I don't know what a 14-year-old feels comfortable around. I don't know what a 10-year-old wants to see in a space to access services. And so having more youth involvement in the planning, which also means maybe paying those youth if it's within your policy, like providing them an honorarium, which also allows them to track their volunteer hours for high school. You know, like there's a couple different dynamics. Bring youth in so much more often. I think it's also true of older populations, right? Like we have this like big cohort of people between age like 21, 22 to 45 planning a lot of our events right now. And that means they'll be built for those people. Very unlikely that they're going to build outside it. So bring them in from the planning phases. There's so like Senior Pride Network does such great events, and I got to do the tech on an event with it, and it was awesome. And it really spoke to the importance of multi-generational events from the planning stage. So then I got, can you speak to gender inclusive washrooms at events? This is an important piece for helping feel safe. What if a venue doesn't have gender inclusive washrooms? So there's a few different approaches I have seen. The most common is making sure that you book a venue with a single stall washroom. Often this is called the accessible washroom. And so then it's talking with your team about like on an accessible washroom, the symbol on the door is genderless, which like in my dream world, we will move towards washrooms just having like the toilet symbol or a sink symbol or like things that are not gendered. However, I have heard interesting and good critiques about like gender-based violence in genderless washrooms, specifically from men harming women and trans folks. And so like straight cis men. And so I think having spaces that have a genderless washroom and gendered washrooms is the most ideal, that are accessible and are considered within the same spaces. I've also been to events where people have just put washroom over the gender sign on the door, which I loved. And it was an excellent event, which is the Anarchist Book Fair. And they just said, fuck it. And oh, sorry, Kate, I didn't mean to swear. I worked so hard the whole time to not do that. Yeah, they just chose to ignore the and put the signs. You can also negotiate this with the venue. If they have a single stall washroom and it has a gendered sign, have that conversation. Have that conflict ahead of time if you can. And then it also really tells you your venue's gender politics and training. Because if they're like, absolutely not, where people know how to go. People know how to go to the washroom. We do it our whole lives. And so if you have the symbols, like if there's the option to move towards single stall, amazing. Spaces are not going to do a bunch of construction all at once. And so having also a knowledge of with gendered washrooms, what if someone is non-binary and doesn't want to use either of those spaces, what are their options? Like, and I can think of places where they have like a staff washroom that's not an absurd thing that you have to navigate like back offices, but is actually just out, it's a single stall washroom. And so, yeah, and then the other safety piece is advertising what washrooms are available. It is an accessibility measure to have, like, we have like a genderless washroom, there's like a men's washroom, a women's washroom, and put like what accessibility is in each, you know. And then, the other piece I would say with that is like, make sure your team is well trained. So if you have like a marshal team, which I didn't even get to go into the roles of marshals, but I once went to a concert in Toronto at a venue, and I went in the men's washroom and it was fine until I walked out and the security guard was like, "What the hell?" And I was like, "What the hell?" like you don't get to say anything. And I understand you're just doing your job, probably for not great pay. I worked at Meridian Center. I understand, but really making sure the folks who are helping like direct traffic or support safety have an understanding that they shouldn't be judging who walks in and out of washrooms, and that if that interaction happens with another participant, to intervene and be like, we don't judge people for the washroom they use. I'll ask you to continue on your way. I got another question directly about, do you have recommendations, good examples of how to educate volunteers about accessibility? Yeah, volunteer training is a huge part of event planning, which might be another follow-up conversation, because volunteers do really need some sense of what's going on. So whether it's training them in harm reduction, I think the other thing about a volunteer training is too often we have the trainings and then we say, okay, bye, have a good night, take snacks, instead of building in conversations. So around accessibility, there's a lot of different things in there, like around like knowing who is the first aid person on site, knowing who is the media contact on site, knowing who is the police liaison on site. But I think holding space for training your volunteers ahead of time and allowing them to ask questions is a huge part. And then walk people through specific accessibility examples, because people will believe like a ramp or like an accessible venue. Like, of course, a volunteer who maybe might be new to it is like, yep, this is an accessible event. And then they have a person show up who maybe needs a quiet space and is starting to like have a panic attack, and you don't have that available. And then that person's like, this is not actually accessible to me. And the volunteer is faced in that moment to be like, oh shit, sorry, Kate. Oh no. It was, I don't know what to do. And giving your volunteers resources to not have to be the experts, but be able to reach the organizer to better help navigate some of those. Also give your volunteers clear maps and guidelines. So if you have if your accessible washrooms on a different floor, or your gender inclusive washrooms on a different floor, have someone be willing to walk with whoever's looking for the washroom to find that space. Like make sure your volunteers are well equipped to talk about accessibility. Also that your volunteers have boundaries, because I know we've all gone to many events where you watch a patron talk to an usher for an hour after the event, and that usher might just want to go home, and they have the right to. And so being able to let your volunteers be engaged in these really good conversations, but also give them space to process and know like they're not paid staff. The other thing is accessibility is so exciting. It's like such an up and coming conversation. Like I would love to talk for hours and hours about having visual guides instead of written guides and all these things. And your volunteers might be passionate about accessibility too. And the other piece I will say about volunteers and accessibility right before we end is make your events as accessible as you can to volunteers. So if you have volunteer meetings that are in an inaccessible space, consider moving that online. Because one, we can have online meetings much more easily now. And we need the perspectives of those who can't access, like 3 cases of stairs. Consider filming your events. There's a lot of venues in downtown St. Catharines where you have to climb stairs to get to the performance space. Film those events and live stream them. 1, because we can now, and 2, it does make it more accessible. It brings more people into your spaces. And it makes people trust that you take accessibility seriously. And yeah, there's stuff about follow-up. You'll see it in the slides. My email is at the end, and so I'm happy to receive it. And Clary's email that is there too around accessibility, or around naloxone and harm reduction. And yeah, so many nice faces of new and not new people, and people I haven't seen in a long time because pandemic is difficult. Hello to everyone. Sarah, are you raising your hand? I feel like you might be typing. Oh, bye, nice people. Oh, how do you get feedback is the question. So getting feedback as people say goodbye is, there's a few different ways. Is telling people that you're going to ask for feedback and then actually sending the survey, which is my big Achilles heel I have. So whether it's via email and doing that survey, or holding more open forums. And I know people don't love open forums, but giving opportunity, like within OPIRG, we have a feedback and incident report liaison who is the person, it rotates every 3 months, of who we give our feedback to. And so whether we have an incident report to file, or if someone's like, I think this is a wonderful idea and I want to talk at your board at length, probably a board meeting is not the best spot to do it, but giving them a contact who has a designated amount of time. And then I know there's like having an actual suggestion box, both at the event or at your office or service, so people feel like there's options, feel like there's opportunities, and then not letting that feedback just go into the ether. I think is the best way to actually get the feedback, is like talk, like whether it's a live stream on your Instagram, or talking about it at your AGM or at your members meeting or your volunteer meeting. Talk about feedback, because then you will build up a reputation as someone who takes it seriously, and like reply to people when they send you feedback, and fill in your survey. And then I've seen more tangible things like was it a raffle for participating in a feedback survey? Like, people love raffles. And so worst comes to worst, give an incentive to get that feedback. And then the other piece is consultation. So we've seen a few, OUTniagara is one, where pay people for their insight. If you have an advisory committee and you can afford to pay them, pay them. If you are seeking consultation information, pay them. And so I think there's a few different, like, incentivizing and also building up a reputation around feedback. Oh, good. I'm so glad. I love hearing things are tangible and practical. Okay. For the sake of the recording, I'm going to say goodbye to folks and stop rambling.
Thanks so much, Carrie. This was great. Lots of things to think about and to digest and absorb. It's been wonderful. Thank you.